Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Deep Dive podcast. The discussion you are about to hear is a conversation about just war and pacifism. And in light of the recent developments in the Ukraine, I thought it might be appropriate to add this intro and to say a few things. The first simply being that we record many of these episodes several weeks in advance, so you will notice at no point do we discuss what is happening with Russia, and that is not by design. However, we do recognize that the war in Ukraine has caused people to think perhaps differently about this topic, and has even brought a more personal focus to the idea of just war and pacifism. On that note, I want to say that this conversation is, and always will be, a conversation. Colin and I are not ethicists. We are two fairly novice theologians who are wrestling with a very big idea. And so please recognize that we are not offering any answers to anything that we believe are undebatable. We are simply trying to explore the ideas of Christianity and violence so that we can learn together and think through these issues more clearly. We are devastated by the events that are unfolding. We continue to pray for the Ukraine and ask God to bring peace and reconciliation to all the nations who are involved. With that said, please enjoy this episode of The Deep Dive.
What would we do in a situation like World War II, where the Nazis, a clear and present evil, came into power in our country? He says we would resist and we would die.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Deep Dive podcast. I am Ben. I'm joined by my co-host Colin Wallace.
Hi, Ben.
Hi. How's it going?
I'm good.
Good.
I'm good. I'm feeling super.
Feeling super. We moved from Batman to Superman. Very nice.
Well, that's okay.
For our listeners, Colin is wearing a Superman shirt.
Yes.
Which I tend to think of you as Superman anyway.
Wow.
So
thanks, buddy.
Man of Steel. Man of Steel. So This is not at all a continuation episode. You don't need to have heard any other previous podcasts in order to do this.
Right.
But I'm excited about today because we are going to be talking about pacifism and just war. And this came out of our conversation on C.S. Lewis, because we talked about how wonderful C.S. Lewis is. We talked about how wonderful Tolkien is.
Yes.
But interesting, both of them were not pacifists. Both of them believed in some sense of just war. And, well, it's been criticized as one of their weaker areas. And Colin, you seem to have quite a few opinions on this. And so today I thought it would be good that we could get into a conversation about it, maybe a debate.
Ooh,
I don't know. We're going to see how aligned we are.
Yeah.
But I also thought we could just cut to the chase, everybody, and see how pacifist Colin really is. Here he goes.
Oh, no, don't do it, man.
Okay.
Sorry.
For those of you listening, he cowered almost immediately.
Yep. I'm a coward.
So it checks out. Out. He is truly a pacifist. No. This is an interesting conversation. Let's just start with the fact that before we get into any of the theology behind it, I think it's a deeply personal topic.
For sure.
I think it's something that when you're talking about violence and Christianity, we begin not from a place of, well, what are the moral and ethical arguments for this? We begin, I think, with a place of how we feel and react to the world around us.
Yes.
Right? I think there's clearly something in the water in culture. You go and watch Hollywood movies. We've glamorized violence. We've glamorized. I mean, we got Batman sitting right here. Okay, there's an element. We could talk about that.
Yes.
But there's this element of like we like vengeance. We like revenge, and we've sort of legitimized it, right? We've made it. But I also want to say that there's other times where that sort of Hollywood energy of like the good guy's allowed to kill the bad guy and it's totally fine is, I think, clearly complicated for us when we look at it. I think of another movie based on real life events of The Darkest Hour with Winston Churchill, World War II.
I haven't seen that one yet.
That's one of my favorite movies of the last. Honestly,
really?
I did love it.
Oh, that's
it takes
high
some
praise.
Artistic liberties, and Gary Oldman plays Churchill, and he's fantastic at it. But
Oldman's awesome.
In that movie, there's more of a sense of like, yeah, this isn't about the glorification of violence and vengeance. This is now let's imagine in a putting ourselves in a social position in which you're definitely conflicted as to what is the proper response. For those who aren't familiar with the film or maybe that history as much, Churchill, first of all, we're talking about not just an individual choice, we're now talking about it at a state level.
Yes.
And that's something we're going to have to discuss. But
that is a significant difference.
That's a big difference that we need to get into. But I just want to frame it in sense of like when I was watching this movie, the emotional, personal, the feeling of going like, Hitler's armies are coming to take over your neighborhoods, and what is our response to that? It's not so easy to live in some idealism of you're either a pacifist or a just war person. So I just think we need to begin, I think, with that personal element. We'll get into that more. But Colin, why don't you tell me a little bit about where you stand on this subject? What makes you so passionate about it?
For sure. So just to say off the top, I'm the son of a military man. My adopted father was a soldier involved in the war. He actually fought in World War II. That shows you how old I am and how late of a surprise I was to my family. And so I was just raised like many other folks, just thinking, yeah, absolutely, we're the good guys. The Nazis were the bad guys, not a problem with like war or violence or things like that. Pretty much accepting the common, version of events the way as you just described, that we just have a certain degree of just this is how it works. And the turn for me was when I was like in my early 30s. I was doing some research. I was then working full time at an urban mission, working with poor folks and homeless folks and that sort of thing. And I was just doing as much knowledge building as I could about issues of social justice and stuff, so that I could just understand this work. What does the Bible have to say about those sorts of issues? And of course, that's probably a future episode as well. But as I was doing that, I came across the teachings of Martin Luther King. And actually read some of his words. I think I found an essay online that was talking about both his social justice ideas and his nonviolent ideas. So it wasn't actually a work of his, but someone quoting quite liberally from him. And I was really convinced after reading that. It like stuck in my craw. I'm like going, man, he makes a lot of really good points. And just thinking about it and praying about it, I'm like going, I think he's right. I think I need to be someone, if I really want to be faithful to Jesus and what he taught, I need to also believe in nonviolence. And talked to my wife Charlene about that, and we both agreed. And then things got interesting, because then I started telling my other Christian friends about this is the conclusion I've come to. And you're talking about reactions. Like, I think I could have told people I was going to convert to Islam and would have gotten less reaction.
Because I wanted to ask that already. I mean, so this wasn't something common. Sometimes I think people either think that pacifism is actually really popular. Yeah. And it's like kind of the going understanding of most Christians. And then depending on where you come from, that's completely not the case. It's the fringe idea.
That's right.
An interesting statistic just to bring up here, because I remember once studying about like the death penalty in the United States. The states that have the highest church attendance also have the highest support for the death penalty.
That's a disturbing...
right? Now, you might think it's disturbing. Other people might think that makes total sense. But it's interesting where different people come from on this, what seems obvious to some of us. And that's why I was interested that you just said, by the way, I say interesting all the time. And now that I've said it,
it's because you're an interesting guy.
I'm going to have to just stop saying it all the time. But I did find it interesting that you're saying you had this sort of when you read Martin Luther King. Was it not something that from your initial impressions of Christianity just got you there already?
Well, to some degree.
Okay.
I think, you can't help but read the Sermon on the Mount and be really affected by it. Sure. And I remember some of my early responses, when first time I was reading the Sermon on the Mount, I'm like, I cannot live this way. Like, I'm just thinking this is just such a high bar.
Yeah, it just doesn't.
That Jesus is.
There's no way I could live up to this.
Whoa. And, and I think, we might have talked about this already a bit, but that there's a difference between what's in the Bible and the glasses, the lenses through which we understand the Bible, what is taught us in church. What is popular thought? So we can see, and I've, again, only become more convinced that it's the actual biblical response. Jesus, not just Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, but I think all the apostles, in one way or another, advocate for this. And we don't necessarily add it together, though, in our teaching. In typical conservative evangelical circles, that's not what is taught. And so I think I had some degree of there's something beautiful and awesome that Jesus is saying here. It's way beyond me. And then as I continue to learn and grow in the church, that just never became something. I can't. Right. I don't think, besides my own teaching, I don't think I've ever heard a teaching anywhere outside of the meeting house in Ontario.
Yes,
where I've heard a sermon on nonviolence.
That's the first place where I was really introduced to it. Also, I should just say, as like a core teaching of a church. Which, if you don't know the meeting house, which Bruxy Cavey had passed, I think there's some complications there.
There is some complications there, sadly.
Something to talk about, actually. But the meeting house really centered itself around. They are Anabaptish, they call themselves, yes. Right? So not Anabaptists, which is an early church movement, and it's sort of an amorphous term as well. But Anabaptists, just for our listeners. Pacifism is core to their understanding.
That's right.
As a church. They also think of things like Acts 2 as being prescriptive and not descriptive, hence the name The Meeting House. Deepwater itself, our church, was actually modeled very similarly to that in terms of a church model.
Because they're a multi-site church. Yeah.
Yeah, because of a multi-site church. And as kind of having like little groups that meet. But the point is, violence... nonviolence, a commitment to nonviolence was definitely at the core of their teaching. It was the first time I ever heard that, and at least from a church in that way.
Yes.
And so this, maybe before we even continue with this, I think it's important to parse out exactly what you're saying in terms of what do we mean when we talk about pacifism? Because pacifism has multiple different orientations. Pacifism can come in an absolute form where you're just saying absolutely no violence ever. But then there are also conditional pacifists. You get into a whole bunch of different ethical subcategories where pacifism is what is practiced. It's sort of a virtue to obtain or attain to, but it is not necessarily saying in all and every case no violence. So I think it's important to say that. I also think it's important to say that on the other side, when you talk about pacifism versus just war, I don't believe that there's any just war theorists out there who are trying to say that war is a good thing, that war is anything but a last resort, but they see it as somehow it can be necessary in these cases, whereas pacifists, by and large, say it's never really justified. You can't put that terminology on it.
Yes.
But there are some forms of pacifism that still say there are borderline cases.
Yeah.
And I might have to say, maybe from more of a personal level, but also, this delves into the theology I've studied, I might sit more on that borderline case rather than an absolute. But you're pretty full on.
Absolute in the sense of, like, I think I want to just locate my belief in nonviolence it's very rooted in being a follower of Jesus. So I don't necessarily ascribe to what everyone would say about pacifism or nonviolence, but it's very rooted in Jesus. It's very rooted in, again, how Martin Luther King would draw back his understanding of nonviolence to Jesus. Gandhi would probably be a secondary influence there, but even Gandhi was also influenced by Jesus in his
and Gandhi,
belief in nonviolence.
I think Gandhi is a name we immediately think of when we think of pacifism,
yes.
At least for those who are familiar with him and his history and how he liberated India from the British Crown.
That's right.
But again, Gandhi himself was not an absolute pacifist. Gandhi thought of his pacifism as more within what's called consequentialist ethics, in the sense that he said this is actually the best weapon. Peace can be a tool. Peace can be a weapon, he said, to liberate our people.
That's right.
And if we get into a violent conflict with Britain, it's not that we are just doing it because that's the Christian thing to do, or that's even the Muslim or Hindu thing to do. It's because that's our best way of getting what we want.
That's right. It's a tactical choice.
Right.
Right. Whereas I would say that, and it's interesting because, talking about by influences, Martin Luther King was the guy who, really converted me to nonviolence. Mm-hmm. And then as I wanted to grow in that area as well, I came across Anabaptist theology and teaching about this, most prominently John Howard Yoder, who's another sadly controversial figure. Who didn't necessarily live up to his own ethic of nonviolence.
We got to talk about this because I think this is an important place to go into.
Yeah, I think so.
And we are the Deep Dive podcast, so part of this is to try and give a little bit of context to maybe some of the figures who we'd like to talk about in terms of
let me kind of describe that. So I read some of John Howard Yoder's books because before I knew really much about him as a person. I would read books that would refer to books and we would refer to John Howard Yoder or something. And I want to read John Howard Yoder's books. And then I read John Howard Yoder's books. Then I ended up taking my master's, going through for my master's at a Mennonite college at University of Waterloo. Mennonites are Anabaptists are nonviolent, pacifistic. And I learned there that, and I didn't know this otherwise, that he had been involved for years, if not decades, in serial sexual harassment and assault of women in his life and coworkers.
Okay, so let's just back up a little bit here. Because this is where I want to. John Howard Yoder, a couple of names I want to just lay out and give a little brief history of so everyone knows what we're talking about. But John Howard Yoder, theologian, pastor, wrote maybe one of the most pivotal works of the last 50 years in theology, I would say, called The Politics of Jesus.
Absolutely. Fantastic book.
And there's two other names I want to bring in who circulate around Yoder, his influence, and maybe who we should talk about. The two names are Reinhold Niebuhr, who's an American pastor.
His opposite.
Takes the oppositional view. And the other name is Stanley Hauerwas. And the reason why I want to bring up Stanley Hauerwas is not only because Hauerwas is he's Anabaptist.
Yep.
He is also one of the leading, not only theologians, but I'd say ethicists. Theology, Karl Barth once said that all theology is ethics, but I think it's important that they are kind of different disciplines. They should be distinguished. Hauerwas is committed to nonviolence, but Hauerwas' own story was he read Reinhold Niebuhr, who was... And Niebuhr himself was a pastor who went through this process of, I'm a pacifist because of World War I and how horrible it was, and then realized for himself pacifism and its policies were too naive.
Yes.
And we'll talk about him in a second, but then he went into more of a just war stance. Hauerwas says, I listened to Niebuhr, I was totally convinced by Niebuhr, then I read Yoder. And Yoder changed everything. So The Politics of Jesus was the first major theological, ethical work to posit nonviolence as the core tenet of the gospel.
Yes.
It is the core of the gospel. And one of the things that Yoder did in that book is he took a bunch of arguments of the just war people and tried to dismantle them. And a lot of those arguments revolved around these ideas of, well, Jesus might represent some sort of ideal, but he was only on earth for a specific amount of time to accomplish a certain mission. He wasn't interested in the sort of practical applications that we need to worry about in our social lives, right? Part of Yoder's argument there has to do with the idea of how do we as Christians engage in politics? And it's interesting, especially if you follow Hauerwas on this, most people walk away thinking that these guys are apolitical. They are not apolitical.
No, quite the opposite. Yeah,
quite the opposite. But opposite in the sense that they think the church its own body politic.
Yes,
that's a huge distinction that people
need to
be.
If the church is the church,
exactly,
that is the answer that the world is looking for.
Right, and so how it engages, how the church as a whole engages, in those political affairs.
That's right.
Matters immensely. And Hauerwas basically one of his famous lines, because Hauerwas is one of these sort of witty, even snarky sometimes guys. He's quite a character. I mean, he's really interesting to listen to. But I love one of his lines is, "It's really hard to love your neighbor when they're dead." So that's kind of like at the center of his pacifism is there is just no way that you can actually reconcile Christ and his ethic with any sort of violent approaches to both politics on an actual political level, also the social level and the individual moral level. So
and because of Howard Yoder's prominence in this way, because he was such a rock star, not just in Mennonite circles, although he was certainly a rock star in Mennonite circles, but in the world of theology, again, as you said, this book, The Politics of Jesus, echoed out to other traditions. Absolutely.
So it was major. But then, as to your point and what we had mentioned, then all of a sudden after Yoder's, and he was still alive when this happened, all of a sudden he found guilty of just a tremendous amount of abuse that was happening within the church to women, specifically to women.
And sadly, the Mennonite church, because he was such a rock star, suppressed it. And Yoder, from what I know, remained almost unapologetic, actually, about it, which not only, and so there's a number of questions here, especially about can you even still teach Yoder given his personal character? Now, you can ask that about any question of any theologian. But what's interesting in Yoder's case and why it's so important to talk about is because some of the argument has been that it's precisely his teachings on pacifism that helped suppress those who were underneath his dominance. Yes.
And therefore, I know many teachers myself who say, I will never hand any student a book of Yoder's because it was embedded in his own pacifistic theology was a way of suppressing and silencing voices. So this is a major part of this debate.
Absolutely.
It complicates the picture of pacifism. If there's one major criticism of absolute pacifism, it is that pacifists can become complicit in structures and powers of evil that are equally as deletritous as, is that even the right word? I don't know. As just war theorists.
Yes.
So there's obviously responses to this, but there is this tension. There is this question. What do you say, Colin?
Yeah, I say that's probably, we could have a conversation about that. There's been so many scandals come to light recently. Ravi Zacharias, the whole rise and fall of Mars Hill.
Big time.
We could have a whole podcast about how Christian figures,
how Mark Driscoll's church, Mars Hill, how that kind of went from. I mean, that podcast really tries to say it moved from just sort of a complementarianism of like women should be subordinate to straight up rape culture within the church. So yeah.
So there's,
although he was no pacifist.
So much we could say about that. Yeah, he definitely wasn't. I once heard him say something about, I don't like a certain portrayal of Jesus because I wouldn't want to worship someone I could beat up.
That's right. Well, and so this is, again, it's not that tension goes away. I think this would be to the criticism that pacifists, you become complicit in powers of evil. Hauerwas has explicitly gone out and said, so do you. It's not like you avoid it as being a part of some just war idea, but you do have to be okay. And this is maybe a question I would pose to you: is one of the difficulties of maintaining absolute pacifism is being okay with watching other people suffer and not being able to do anything about it. And is that a thing we can commit to?
Yes, that is a hugely important question to ask. And I think it goes back to, again, certain words of Scripture, certain things that Jesus taught that you'll rarely hear on a Sunday morning. And that is things like, if you want to follow me, you must take up your cross. Right. Now, again, we've domesticated that word, take up your cross, to mean, we all have a cross to bear, right? That's a saying. This is my cross to bear. That's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus isn't talking about the fact that we all have our own struggles and difficulties that we just have to bear up in life. Jesus is saying, on one level, I'm going to the cross, and you have to be ready to follow me if you really are going to follow me, like literally follow me. And so if we don't have that sort of a view of my life is already dead, as Paul says, I'm crucified with Christ, you know, my life as when it comes to this world is dead. Now now Christ is living out my life. And so when it comes to other people, I totally recognize that's a different thing. It might be one thing for me to say I'm willing to take a punch or whatever, but I'm not willing to let my, someone I really care about to take a punch, right? That does present a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that the New Testament and especially the book of Revelation calls us to. Right. You know, the book of Revelation, there's a refrain that happens many times in Revelation that the people of God must learn to endure. You know, we must, and that's often in prophetic language said that we conquer when we do that. When we endure, we conquer. And
this raises an interesting point about the nonviolence we're talking about, because we talk about Jesus as nonviolent, and yet in the Gospels he might be portrayed in such a way, but in Revelation he's not portrayed as nonviolent in one sense. And in another sense, the violence we're talking about, I've heard it argued, it's not that the Bible is about nonviolence, it's about delayed violence, right? Paul says, when you do good to others, you heap coals upon their heads.
Right.
That if there's a coming judgment, if vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, there is still a vengeance, there is still a judgment, there is still a violence that takes place. It was imperative that Jesus did not participate in it. But this idea that it's completely a nonviolent paradigm is a challenge to pacifism.
Yes. Well, I would say, first of all, about Revelation, that Jesus is not literally a lamb that was slain that is still alive and has 7 horns. Like, that's not literally true of who Jesus is. That's a metaphor to describe Jesus, right? That's how he's portrayed in Revelation 5 and 6, right?
I might be uneasy with the idea that it's just a metaphor in one sense.
And in the same way, I think in, what is it, Revelation 19, where Jesus is the rider on the horse, whose name is Faithful and True, his blood is dipped in his robe is dipped in blood. That's equally, I think, a metaphor to talk about the absolute soundness, completeness of his victory over the forces of evil. Would be my initial response to that. The second part of what you said, what was that again? About deferred violence.
Delayed violence.
I think that the nonviolence we are called to is in part related to who we are. So actually, why don't I get into some of my points I wanted to make?
We talked about this before. You have about 3 main points that you'd like to.
That's right.
Like to hit on.
There's one other thing that we just left hanging there a little bit, because you talked about nonviolence as for Gandhi as being a tactic, and when I was at Conrad Grable, go Conrad Grable, love you guys. When I was there, I learned that there was for many Mennonite theologians and activists, peace and nonviolence is almost like that. It's almost like, for some Mennonites, not all, it's like peace and nonviolence is almost more important than Jesus, right? It becomes the answer to everything. And I would not necessarily ascribe to that. Again, I think it comes back to Jesus. If I'm a follower of Jesus, then this is what he's called me to do and be. And so my 3 points that I've come to, having, again, as I mentioned to you, having had to defend myself for many years, I would have been, again, in my early 30s. I don't know exactly when I kind of came to this decision that I want that to be a real follower of Jesus, I need to be ascribed to nonviolence. So it's been 20 years, and I've had my share of having to push back and get real criticisms for people and suss things out. And I think these 3 points really help to make my case for why nonviolence is a biblical, legitimate response for us to
is the proper way for Christians to respond. Let's say
my first 2 have to do with like our identity as followers of Jesus. The first one is that, and this is a very, very recovery thing to say, is that As a follower of Jesus, I'm not God. Okay. Right? This is one of the principle one of Celebrate Recovery, and I think it's just generally a good thing for us to keep in mind. And I say we're not God in the sense specifically of, while there's many ways in which we want to imitate Jesus, and he tells us to imitate him in his humbleness and his love for others. At the same time, Jesus received worship, but we wouldn't say, in my quest to be Christ-like, Ben, you should get on your knees and worship me, and I should receive it and go, that's right, you should do that. No, there's certain things that because God is God, mm-hmm. he can have that I can't imitate. And I think one of those is, again, receiving worship. Another one is judgment. It's up to God to judge and to punish.
In the sense of exacting judgment.
That's right. Exacting judgment, exacting vengeance. And yeah, Paul says this explicitly in Romans chapter 12, right? Near the end of the chapter. Don't take revenge, brothers and sisters. Leave room for God's judgment. For the Torah says, vengeance is mine. It is, I will repay. So I think, some folks have, and you mentioned this already, this idea of deferred, mm-hmm. Violence. And what I'm saying is that if there's one person who is qualified to mete out violence and judgment on an evil human being, it's God, not another human being.
Right.
Because I wish I knew off the top of my head, this is just a bit of an ad lib, but there's a Russian novelist who he was in the Gulag for a while, and he wrote a fantastic...
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag
and he said
Archipelago.
The line, yes, that's right.
The line between good and evil runs through each individual human heart. Yeah.
That's right. Not between my nation and another nation.
Right.
Each of us is sinful. So what right do I have to judge you, to think that I can, inflict violence on you and be justifiable in it when I do bad things too? And I'm as equally under God's wrath if I'm not living a life of repentance. So that's my first argument, is that I ascribe to nonviolence because I'm not God.
Okay.
Second aspect of my identity that helps undergird my understanding of nonviolence is that I'm ultimately a citizen of God's kingdom, not of Canada or any earthly nation. All of us, as followers of Jesus, ultimately our primary loyalty must be to God and God's kingdom. Jesus is our king, and therefore Queen Lizzie, God bless her, she's 90 now or something like that, or been reigning for 90 or some crazy amount of years. Anyway, God bless her, but she's not my ultimate authority over me. I will be a good citizen, a good subject of her. I will obey the laws of the government I'm in, as long as they don't contradict my ultimate loyalty to what King Jesus tells me to do. And King Jesus tells me to love my enemies and turn the other cheek, and so on. And so therefore, if my country starts a draft and says you must go to war and fight our enemies, I say no, because I'm a subject of King Jesus, and it's very clear in the Bible that I'm not to do that. So that's my other argument. And then my last one is more based on history. Where we are, what's our location in history? For the first 300 years of Christianity, Christians ascribed to nonviolence. I mean, certainly I'm sure they were imperfect like the rest of us are. But, you look at any official leader, the writings of the church, including the New Testament, and before Constantine came on the scene.
So Constantine, first Christian emperor of Rome, right, comes to the throne 316 AD. Doesn't make it a state religion, but just important for people to know.
Begins the process of that.
So you have, and this, I think, just before you carry on with that point, just so people are aware, obviously creates a major shift in terms of you're no longer thinking about individual morality when it comes to the Christian faith. You're now thinking of political ethics. If Christians have the throne, if they have any sort of power, can they be in that position?
major question for us.
Yeah, that would be another good topic for a podcast, for just to talk about.
Oh, you
all
could
the
go
ways
into that for
the
quite a while.
Constantine,
But we will talk about it a
impact.
little bit here. But carry on with that.
So my point is that before Constantine, Christians, again, by and large, any official writings, anything you see. Now, some of those writings, I think there's at least one letter that I have in a book, is a Christian bishop writing to some Christians who had joined the Roman army, saying,
if I'm not mistaken, you're talking about Tertullian. And Tertullian
Could have been.
Tertullian writes in the first, well,
second century, I think.
In the second century,
Yep.
but late third century. He is, or late, I don't know. Anyway, third century, 200s AD. But he is maybe one of the first to write an actual, and I think it's, I'm foggy on my title, but it's called like
that.
on the Majesty's Crown or something.
Yes.
And he's speaking about soldiers, and you might be referring to that. That's the one that I have in my mind.
That's what I think.
And he's maybe one of the first to address the actual ethics of this before you get to Augustine later on, who probably is the first to go into a major just war breakdown and actually support some idea.
I think you're right. I wasn't sure if it was Tertullian off the top of my head, but you could be right about that. But anyway, so obviously there are some Christians, even before Constantine, who thought, I can join the army, I can do this or do that. So it's not necessarily a universally held thing. I mean, the church, there's always going to be some variance.
Well, I think these are great points to go from, but I do now want to play a little bit of devil's advocate on all of them.
By all means, sir.
And maybe we'll begin where we ended with that last point, because I do think this is, as a matter of fact, I recently read an article from somebody, from Conrad Grebel.
Oh, excellent.
Who was arguing this very point of asking the question, were the early church fathers in fact pacifists? And again, I think we just need to clarify the way in which we use that language. It's important that we haven't said this yet, that all forms of pacifism are not passive. All
Correct.
forms of pacifism are not, let's lay down and do nothing. All forms of pacifism, at least within the Christian church that have been taught, are, you act, you go do stuff. Jesus was a gadfly, right? Okay, he was sticking it to people for sure and bothering them, and doing all kinds of stuff to make people angry and protesting the powers that be. You are responsible to do that. So our fight for justice still exists, even if you're a pacifist. That's important to understand.
Correct.
But there is I think, false understanding that the early church was just unanimously this way, if we think about that in the sense that they never believed violence was necessary. And again, I would say within the church, all teachings of it are always pushing, whether they call themselves just war theorists or pacifists, are all pushing violence as a very, very last resort. We are talking about, I want to just offer some technical terminology here, because again, it is the deep dive. That's what we want to do.
Right.
This is a conversation in ethics. And so what you're fighting against here is what's called a deontological ethic versus either a utilitarian or a consequentialist, which I mentioned. A deontological ethic just says you don't do something, or you do something because it's just what you're supposed to do. It's a rule-based ethic. So it's typically attributed to Immanuel Kant, who is a deontologist. The idea is certain things are just bad. Kant said you don't lie ever, because lying is not good. You should behave in a way that you can only ascribe it universally to everybody. Yes. And so lying would be bad if I did it, but it's bad because if everyone did it, we'd all be screwed. So nobody should lie ever under any circumstance. There's no situational ethic in which that makes it correct. On the other side, you have consequentialists going, well, what would be the outcome of this? And then you have, and kind of aligned with it, a utilitarian sense. It's like, well, is it better? You have to blow up two boats. One has 50 people, one has 40 people. Which one are you going to choose? Well, what's the better outcome? Okay, that's utilitarian.
What's the greatest good?
The Christian church largely is just deontological, I think, on this point. They're going, the Bible, as you've kind of said, Jesus operates within a mandate. We don't do violence. That's not the way we operate. It's important to recognize that Jesus himself said the words, I have come to bring the sword, not peace. What I think he means by this is, as a result of my forgiveness peace that I'm offering, it's going to create violence among many of you.
Yes.
And I'm okay with allowing that to happen. I think that's an important component to this whole thing when we are talking about pacifism, because people want to weigh the scales and look at it.
But again, some of the challenge with that is that people will just quote, Jesus said, "I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword,"
and use it as
it as saying, Jesus didn't come to. But you have to compare that with the rest of what Jesus had to say.
Absolutely.
And also understand the context and what he's talking about. He's talking about division. A sword metaphorically of division.
Which, yeah, exactly. Cuts
that
people.
He would cause.
Would cause brother to fight with, brother and cause families to be divisive with each other.
That's right. Because if you don't love him more than your family, you're not worthy of him.
But I think, that's still incredibly relevant to the idea that pacifism has to, in some way, going back to that earlier point we said with Stanley Hauerwas, pacifism has to somewhat be okay with allowing other people to suffer. That it doesn't, when you get into real, World War I was maybe the first time that you had this major shift of like conscientious objectors and people not wanting to be a part of the war. But you go back to like slavery. Do you fight in a war to stop slavery, right? Can you be a deontologist? Can you just be a rule-based, like, no, we just don't do violence? But it's like you're not participating in violence may cause further destruction, right? I think you're right in the sense that the early church, going back to that point, the early church is largely deontological in the sense that they're going, we don't commit any violence because that's the Jesus way. But it doesn't seem to form itself in any absolute sense in some of their writings. It seems like the emphasis is far more, and this is what I got out of that article, the emphasis is on hatred, malice, anger, subduing those things, because once you rid yourself of those passions, right? The Bible says, don't be hot-tempered, because in that anger, that leads to murder.
Yes,
right?
That's
I'm
right.
paraphrasing, obviously, one of the Proverbs, but the idea is...
And Jesus himself in the Sermon on the Mount, right?
The issue, and Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. The issue is anger within me, my hot-temperedness that results in the murder. If we get rid of that, we're going to solve most of the violence issue.
Absolutely.
But, and here's where the big but comes in.
We always need to have a big but on
you
the
need to have a big
dive.
on the just war pacifist debate, is that same deontological ethic can be argued from the opposite standpoint, that sometimes it is absolutely necessary that violence take place in order to subdue a certain evil, even if it's not anger and hatred towards somebody. And I think you actually do see forms of this in the early church. So I think you find it in Origen, for instance, who is like the first theological rock star of the early church. Yes. And I think you kind of see it in Tertullian as well, in his own, talking to that soldier. At no point, and this gets argued from Jesus all the time too, at no point does he tell the soldiers, stop being soldiers. What do we do with that? Do you have, because this goes, the Meeting House, I'll just go back to them too. They were the first church I ever saw where they were straight up like, you shouldn't be a police officer and be a Christian. And I was like, wow, what a, you got to respect in one sense the boldness of that statement. Because it's just like, you're going to alienate so many people.
Yes.
But they were that committed. I don't think I can go that far. Yes. I don't think that's necessary, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, and if you see that as a challenge to some of those points.
You're talking about some of the classic approaches to ethics of utilitarianism and such. I think we're not just talking deontology when it comes to nonviolent ethics. I think it's also a virtue ethic, which is, I think you were already sort of alluding to the fact that the idea is not just that I'm obeying a rule, but I'm trying to engender something within myself so that I don't get angry and I don't get wrathful towards someone else and slip into the sin of violence and murder or whatever.
Pacifism is a practice.
That's right.
Let's just say it's not just an ideal. I think this is where it comes down to the personal level, is like pacifism, absolutely, if we're going to commit to it in even in a conditional way.
Yeah.
Or an absolute sense, you are engaged in something that requires the spiritual life. Yes. It requires discipleship in order to actually be a pacifist. Because absolutely, let's be honest, Colin, and this is the thing. Maybe this is my big hang up with where it's like, I'm not a just war guy.
Yes.
I'm definitely on the pacifist side. but I know what I'm going to do in certain situations. And it's not like there's no way I would stand before my God and plead forgiveness before I would allow somebody to take my daughter away from me. Do you know what I mean? And if that meant violence, I just can't, you might think that's just a purely personal argument, but it has gravitas within the ethical debate.
It does.
And it doesn't go away. Yeah. And I think, and by the way, and just to tie this in, sorry, I keep talking about.
No, it's all good.
People like Reinhold Niebuhr, who were pacifists because he saw World War I and was like, this is disgusting and horrible and never good, became just war type people because of what was called Christian realism, the understanding that original sin was at the heart of his theology. And he really believed, he said, pacifists just become naive about the amount of evil that's in the world. And if at the end of the day, and then it was also a thing about the individual trying to live a pacifistic life, but that also then being incorporated into a larger societal structure where because we criticize Constantine for being, like Constantine, he's the emperor of Rome, and that creates these violent, movements within the church. But there's another argument to say, didn't we want Constantine to be Christian? Don't we want our people in politics at the federal level who are engaged in wars constantly to be Christians and to try and live out that ethic? And that doesn't mean necessarily disbanding the military. I mean, it's tough.
Yeah. I would say that I don't necessarily reject violence and war because of a tactical approach, because I think that nonviolence is the better way to defeat evil. But I would say that, again, going back to what was the Russian author's name? I can't pronounce
Alexander
it.
Solzhenitsyn.
Solzhenitsyn makes a fantastic point that, again, good and evil is not I'm the good guy and you're the bad guy. Mm-hmm. This is what we often miss out on. We often say something like, what if some criminal is holding, trying to rob a bank and is holding some poor bank teller hostage, and you get a clear shot at that bank robber, easy peasy. Well, to a certain degree, I would have some sympathy with that, because certainly we don't want anyone, we don't want crime to pay, so to speak. But what we are missing out on in that situation is that you're not destroying evil if you kill that guy. You're destroying a person who is not just a bank robber.
I want to say,
irony is when I pick up a gun to shoot someone else, is that who has a gun?
Yes,
we're on an even playing field here. What makes me
right? I want to say I emphatically agree. I mean, and there's no sense in which I wouldn't. I think this is, Hauerwas, again, one of his main challenges is like, the real question just comes down to who is your neighbor? Because in all just war theory approaches, they are looking to, whether you go to Augustine or Aquinas, there were certain conditions that had to be in place for them to say, then it is just to go to war. And the main sort of test was if it's for the protection of the vulnerable. Hauerwas just comes back at that, I think, rightly, and tries to say, but isn't the enemy your neighbor also? And therefore you can't engage. So that's the conundrum that, like, I'm with you. Yeah. I'm totally with you in that regard. But this is where I go back to, I think the emphasis is always on that, the virtue of actually practicing love, patience, kindness, respect, the fruits of the Spirit, all of this, with people, so that it's a ridding ourselves of anger and our hot-temperedness in order to bring us to a place where violent action never arises.
Yeah.
But it must be, though, it seems, I don't know if it sounds like I'm speaking out two sides of my mouth, but it seems that on that state level, in a functioning society, there has to be some sense of there is a justice that can be served, that can do these things.
And Paul would even say that, argues that in Romans 13, right? We have to remember that the chapters and verses in the Bible are not ordained by God, right? They were later inventions. Paul didn't write Romans with 12 and 13 being different chapters. He just wrote the letter.
Oh, right.
And I think that division of between chapter 12 and 13 is in some ways inconvenient, because it makes it seem like Paul's started a different thought, but he hasn't necessarily. He says in the end of chapter 12, it's not your job as a Christian to get revenge on this person who's doing evil. Leave that up to God. And then in the beginning of 13, he says, and God has given the sword to the state and to punish evildoers. So I think God says, I think if I can interpret Paul here on one level, I think what he's saying is that God's plan A for human beings is for us to love each other. Later on in Romans 13, and this gets omitted a lot, Paul says, love does no harm to a neighbor. Right. To love someone means to not do them harm. So, when Augustine later on says, can I love my neighbor and fight with them? No. Can I love my enemies while we're killing them? No, that's not what love is. Yeah. And so plan A is love each other. Plan B is God saying, I recognize that most of the world is not following Jesus, is not ascribing to those ethics. So so better than complete anarchy is at least having states and countries and authorities in place to curb the chaos of the country. So I think there is a degree in which where God says violence by police, to curb crime and things like that within a society has a place. So it's not necessarily God's ultimate good, but it is.
So point number one that you made about if we are not God, it is not our place to, but it does, we are in some sense tasked with making those sorts of, executing the judgment that we see fit on, right? I mean, through
I would
certain
say it's a
systems.
concession that God makes for the world.
But it is a concession, and it is there. Okay.
It's a concession, not necessarily what God wants.
No, I would say it's never what God wants, certainly. But this is where, again, that emphasis from Niebuhr of a Christian realism, of saying you still live in this world marred by sin, is not so easy. I think for some of us, if you just look at Jesus and go, imagine him ever picking up a gun, it's so foreign, foreign to our understanding. And it's true, but is there a but? Is Niebuhr? I think you can't just toss away Niebuhr so simply on that basis. I think
his argument against pacifists saying that you don't understand evil in the world is wrong. I think pacifists do understand evil in the world, and they recognize that evil is not a person. Evil is an act, and for me to again pick up a gun and shoot someone else because I think that person is evil. That act is evil. You and I aren't perfectly good. We're not perfectly evil. We are a mix of both. Even as Christians, even as followers of Jesus, we're on a process of becoming holy, but we're not necessarily completely holy yet. Although, Wesleyans have argued about that for the last 200 to 300 years or whatever. But there's an idea of that. And I think that Martin Luther King says this really well. He talks about how, in his campaigns against racism and such, and the oppression that they faced in the American South, he would say, our goal is not to defeat anyone or to humiliate the white person. Our goal is to win their friendship, and to fight back against a wrong. But we don't do that. If we were to do that through violence, then that's just, again, as Paul would say, fighting evil with evil. But if we fight with good, with loving our neighbors, loving our enemies especially, turning the other cheek, saying you can hit me, you can hurt me, but I will return your violence, your evil, with good, and I will eventually wear you down. And even if you kill us, again, Jesus was killed, right? And yet our hope is not in this world and in this life; it's in the resurrection.
Yes.
And so it's if evil is to be defeated, we need to give up on committing evil acts an idea that I can commit an evil act to defeat evil. Evil still exists then because I've done evil to stop evil, right? Martin Luther King says as well that violence creates a monologue instead of a dialogue. I love that line.
Right.
What a dialogue is
Cyclical
good. A dialogue is what
violence,
we're doing. Is we have different ideas. We're sussing it out. But violence says your voice is not worthy, and I'm going to destroy it. There's only one voice that should be around. That's mine, and that's counter to love for our neighbor. That's counter to everything that God wants for us.
That's really good. Yeah, that is really good stuff. And I think what I want to talk about now is moving that from, because I agree that there's this ideal that we are called to, that we absolutely are. We are called to nonviolence. We are called to be peacemakers. Okay, that's how we are known as Christians, is as peacemakers, and that the idea of laying down our lives is certainly the answer that we are tasked with always. Okay, so to lay down our lives and not to take other lives is important. Where this discussion then typically goes, though, is there is you in the community who does this. But then, as we've been talking, now we have to broaden it to sort of like Augustine had said, there's the city of God, but then there's the city of man. Okay, we are here. We have people in politics who are Christians. We have chaplains. We have Christians who are soldiers. We have people who are in these positions who have to make incredibly difficult decisions to be a part of this. And we need to be able to support that. Or do we? Is part of the question, right? I mean, this is where I said, going back to Bruxy and Meeting House and saying, like, if you're a police officer, you should stop because as a Christian, it might, I can't go to that extreme. And we, I think, should talk about the reasons why. But I also want to offer some support also for what you are saying, because I think we often don't look at the opposite side of the road, that the road less traveled, or the position that wasn't taken, where peaceful, pacifistic opportunities might have presented themselves and weren't. And maybe the best example of this would be something like World War II, which is often seen as the good war.
Yes.
I mean,
so many times people have argued back with me about that.
I think it will always come up, and we have to address it, because what makes so many people consider it good is that it's one of these grand narratives where you just clearly have a force of evil in the world and the good guys got rid of it, right? At least that's the story we're given. I mean, I opened this up with Winston Churchill in The Darkest Hour, that whole thing. But two things I would want to say about it that I think are to what you're saying, Colin. The first is that the actual motivations for, let's say, America to be involved in World War II were not really on the basis of a calculation of the horrible things they were doing to Jews. As a matter of fact, that was kept largely for most of the American population, because they didn't want it to sound like we're engaged in war because we're helping out this vulnerable people. As a matter of fact, they thought that would be a bad PR campaign. So that shows you a little bit more about what the other thing was, that according to the history, and this has become to light recently, apparently the Americans were aware that Hitler had basically threatened to say, if you engage in this war, I'm going to kill all the Jews. Like, I'm breaking it down quite simply, but that's more or less, he was going, if you get involved, you're a superpower, I'm actually going to make this much worse in terms of the body count. And we don't talk about the sense in which, what if America had responded differently and actually said, then give us the Jews? Why don't you bring them here? Why don't we let them seek asylum here and we won't engage in war? What if that had been the tactic, right? I think for Christians, these are questions we need to ask. The problem is that we went to war, we defeated them, and then the atrocities of the Holocaust came to light after the fact, and it gave further support to the just war theorists to say, look, what a great thing we did. Yeah. And therefore it gets propped up as a good thing, and I don't want to go down that road entirely.
I agree. But you know what? Like a proper just war theorist who understands just war would look at World War II and say that wasn't a just war according to just war standards. Like, you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, that is their official stance in the Catholic Church, is just war. Although I think Pope Francis wants to change it to nonviolence.
Right.
Is what I understand. But anyway, so part of just war would be, say, for example, using only enough force and no more.
Yeah.
Well, that certainly wasn't what happened with the Allies against Nazis. I mean, you have
it rarely works,
or the Japanese, right? I mean, the bombing of Dresden was bad or worse than anything that the Nazis did against other, Allied powers like
that was
London or
Niebuhr's
whatever.
principle, basically, too. It was like, if you have to kill people, kill as few as possible.
Yes,
right?
but that wasn't what happened, right?
No, and it rarely does. And that's also that's the argument against it, is that it's like
The
these are really just
Japanese had surrendered
other
when the bombs landed on Nagasaki, but they didn't unconditionally surrender, and the U.S. wanted an unconditional surrender. So they continued bombing. So, like, the challenge with just war is that I think just war is actually more of a case of not understanding the evil of people, because once we were talking about this with anger. Once you get angry, once you get started, I'm going to sound like Yoda here. Once you start down the dark path forever,
that's your Yoda?
Dominate no, I have a terrible Yoda.
It sound like
But anyway, you get the idea that, like, once you there's another saying I've heard: sin will take you further than you want to go. Right? Cost you more than you want to pay, and keep you longer than you want to stay. And I think once you start down on war, all kinds of things happen. Think about the war on terror. How many hundreds of detainees were kept illegally, according to the U.S.'s own laws, and are still kept illegally 20 years later, in Guantanamo Bay, subjected to torture. That's the America today, not that long ago, right? How many innocent civilians were killed in bombings and attacks in the war on terror who had nothing to do?
Well, this is this is the question and the challenge, I think, for absolute pacifism, right? I mean, it goes like, this reminds me too, you mentioned Guantanamo Bay. It reminds me of that, A Few Good Men, right? Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson.
You can't handle the truth.
You can't, and that whole speech, right? He's saying, like, you need people like me. Like, there's a deep truth in actually that whole conversation, even though what he did was wrong. He's saying, I stand 50 feet away from atrocities that you couldn't bear on an everyday level, and somebody has to deal with that. So what does the Christian say about the fact that, like, this is happening? There are people every day. I mean, my brother works, for instance, with national defense. I'm not even allowed to really know what he does entirely. But I mean, I think this topic is something for a guy like him. He's going like, you have no idea what goes on. You have no idea what's going on to keep you protected. So it's easy for us to say these things, but I think we need to just get a little bit more into this question of, like, how can Christians be in the world and be used and be effective and be faithful in those positions that are power positions, whether it be the military or the police force or in our politics. Should they abstain from those things? There are some who think you should. I don't think I would prescribe that. Yeah. I think I would have to say, and this is where my absolute pacifism would crumble. I think I'm conditional in the sense that I go, the ethic of Jesus is a commitment to nonviolence. But part of that commitment is a recognition of sin in the world that needs to try and protect and keep at bay as much as it can without the use of lethal force. But that it is that it is, I don't know if necessary is always the right word, but that there are situations that come upon us that call for certain actions that look violent. I mean, I think one of the things Hauerwas raises too is that when we talk about violence, we rarely know what we really mean. What is violence? What is violent? We talk about violence as being physical harm, and we sometimes laugh at the idea that, like, name calling isn't a form of violence. The Bible doesn't think that way, actually.
That's right.
The Bible does think those things are violent.
Yeah,
so there's
Jesus
all
says
kinds
if you
of
call
forms of
someone an idiot, a loser, worthless,
right,
you're in danger of hell.
So
right, like in that same section of the Bible where he's saying, you've heard it said, don't murder. Well, don't even get angry. Don't even call someone
to not
a name.
engage
it's in the same
violence,
ballpark, right?
To not engage in violence or to pretend like there's some, I don't think it's that easy of an answer, obviously. I think this goes back to me. What I would say is living life as a follower of Jesus requires the costly grace, right, of surrendering myself to, I need to lay my life down, pick up my cross rather than take life, rather than fight in those ways.
Yes.
But that this doesn't actually prevent us entirely from having systems in place that sort of keep a stasis, that sort of keep some semblance of order, and that we need that. And the difficulty is keeping ourselves from moving into an actual hatred and considering this considering our neighbors as somehow they're bad and I'm good. Going back to your Solzhenitsyn thing. I mean, I'm sort of rambling a little bit here, but you mentioned Solzhenitsyn. I think one of the most important things that he teaches there is that when he was sitting in the prison camps in Russia, he took responsibility on himself as a member of that society and said it was because of us that we allowed this sort of power to get in place, and then I became complicit in it. I mean, one of the greatest lessons I think you can learn from Solzhenitsyn is that, and it helps with our understanding of this debate, is that if you want to position yourself as though I wouldn't have been complicit in those atrocities that happened back then, you're dead wrong.
Yes.
Like, it's really easy for us to say the Nazis are really bad. Try saying it if you were a German under the Treaty of Versailles, which was unbelievably draconic.
Yes.
That crushed those people, that allowed the oxygen for a Hitler to rise to power. You go back to 1934 and say to a German, right, like, what's the answer to that? Like, if you think somehow you would have done otherwise, you better have a good reason for thinking. And I'm not saying people didn't. You have the Confessing Church, you have the Barmen Declaration, you have all these kinds of people who resisted it. But that's not so easy if we're not living and practicing a peaceful, nonviolent ethic all the time. So I'm not offering really any major answer here if people are looking for that in the podcast of whether is it always, just war or absolute pacifism. I'm saying as part of this podcast as a conversation, it is an insanely difficult thing that practicing nonviolence, practicing pacifism, I think is the obvious and correct answer for Christians, but that it is not so simple. And that I don't know if I could follow that out. And that I do think as well, we do need systems and structures that are that contain the use of force.
I would say I might maybe disagree with your last comment, just for myself personally. I think we want to make sure that, again, this deep dive, and I think early on we said sort of our subtitle was Conversations in Theology, right? So this is a conversation we're having. I also respect, to some degree, the meeting house making a bold statement like a Christian shouldn't be in the military or a Christian shouldn't be a police officer. I respect that to some degree, as you say. That's a bold statement. You're like putting it out there. But I think the challenge is, and I've learned this in my time of ministry, is that should is a dangerous word. When we should people, we can cause a lot of shame, and shoulding is a lot more simplistic than it should be, right? Your friend comes to you and says that they were in a really difficult situation and they made a mistake, and the last thing they need to hear in that point is you shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, right.
They probably know that already, right? And so maybe some of our listeners are in the military. I know I've met so many people since I've moved here to Nova Scotia who are involved in the military, and to one degree or another. And so the last thing I would want to do is should anyone and say, here's what here I am, the high and mighty pastor of recovery, theologian, expertise guy. I'm not, but I am the pastor of recovery.
I mean, neither of us are experts in ethics or anything. This is a conversation.
So, so I think it's up to each of us to just hear someone else's opinion and do the best we can with sussing it out for ourselves. And if someone is in the military and hears what we're saying and thinks about it and goes, I need to find another career, because of that, I would honor them. In fact, I have a really good friend I left behind in Kitchener-Waterloo. He's an engineer. He worked in this company that made drones. And that company that he was a part of got bought out by an American company that made drones for the military. And so now the work he's doing aids in the drones that are making to blow up people in the Middle East, and he left that job.
Right.
It was a nice paying job. He has 2 kids, and
This
he
happens
made
all
that
the time.
choice
There's
on
many stories.
principle, and I honor him so much for making a bold choice like that. That is fantastic. But at the same time, I wouldn't should someone who is in that similar situation that my friend was in and doesn't, and says, I need to take care of my kids, or someone who's a police officer or in the military or whatever right now and listening to this and going, I hear what you're saying. I really like that. But I'm not convinced yet. I need to take care of my kids. I don't know what I should do. Again, I'm not here to should people that way,
Right.
for sure. I'm just here to express, here's what I've been convinced of, completely. And the last thing you said about, we need to have process, some kind of resources at our disposal that will use force. I'm not convinced of that. I would ask, who's the we in that situation? Because as us as followers of Jesus goes, again, if my loyalty, if the foundation of my life is on Christ, then it doesn't matter to me what is going on in the world. I need to be ready to suffer. I read a great book. I suggest it to anyone who's listening to this. It's called A Faith Not Worth Fighting For. And it's one of those books where there's different authors addressing commonly asked questions about pacifism. And this one author responds, what would we do if the question was he was wrestling with was, what would we do in a situation like World War II, where the Nazis, a clear and present evil, came into power in our country? He says, we would resist and we would die. That's his blunt answer. And I'm like thinking, we need to be ready for that. Because if I'm too relaxed and thinking, there's evil in the world, but man, the police and the military, they'll take care of it for me. That's not up to me. That's not a Jesus position. The Jesus position is I'll go where I need to go. I'll do what I need to do. And if Jesus calls me to die, I'll die. And I'm not saying this in any way. I want to make sure I'm letting people know. I worked for 20 years in a downtown ministry, working with street folks and people who are homeless, criminals, and that kind of thing. I've been punched. I've been kicked. I've been threatened with death. I even got pepper sprayed once. I've gotten in the way between 2 guys fighting to do my best to make peace in my situation. So I'm not just talking about something theoretically.
Right on.
I've taken these principles and taken the lumps for it to say, I'm not going to just say you shouldn't go to fight. If I see a fight, I'm going to get in the middle of it, and I'm going to say, no, we're not going to do this. This is not the right way. And I think that's what we're called to do, and that's what we're called to be, in my opinion. And there's a fantastic book, if you haven't read it before, The Imitation of Christ. Has some fantastic spiritual insights in it.
Thomas à Kempis. Yeah.
Thomas à Kempis, yep. And one of the lines in there that has stayed with me, I've read it several times in my life, is that he says it's good for a person not to be too comfortable. I think being too comfortable for us in our situation on a number of levels takes away from our spiritual growth, takes away from, I think, our stance on ethical issues that we need to take a stand on. We won't do that because we're comfortable. Think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and our other man, Karl Barth. Karl Barth took a stand, wrote up the Barmen Declaration and made a stand against Hitler, and was kicked out of Germany for it. Yep. Sophie Scholl, another Christian in Germany during World War II. You heard of Sophie Scholl before? Yep. Fantastic. Her and her brother made a nonviolent stand against the Nazis, just did their best to try to get information about the evils that the Nazi regime was doing, getting it out there in the White Rose resistance movement. She got arrested and killed for what she was doing. We need to be ready to take a stand and be ready to pay the price, and not just rest on the fact that there's police and they'll kill the bad guys for me. no, I need to stand up to those bad guys, and I need to be ready to take the truth of my faith, not just in the things I say, but in the actions that I take, is how I would respond to that.
Wow. That, deeply challenging, some of the stuff that you've said, and I really appreciate it. And I think this is, to our listeners as well, this is an ongoing conversation and a difficult one.
Absolutely.
And
a conversation.
Engage in it, or send us an email, or make some comments, and we can talk about it more, because it is an incredibly difficult thing. But I will just affirm, I am constantly, I think, convicted by, and I liked that line you said, that we would resist and we would die. The early church, there's the Tertullian quote, and actually it was brought up in the sermon.
The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church.
Is the seed of the church. And I think it's impossible to get away from that. It's impossible to get away from the fact that we are called to lay down our life. We're called to resist. So not passive.
That's right. Yeah, pacifism doesn't come from the word passive.
No. And to
but
resist
from
as best we can,
to make peace.
But that it might cost us our life. And as you brought up Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I think is one of our contemporary martyrs, in the sense that he died resisting Nazism and died in a prison camp there in Germany. And he talked himself about cheap grace and costly grace, and the difference and the cost of discipleship. And he said, when Jesus calls us, he bids us come and die. And I think that's the wrestle that we have. And just to be clear, that, when I offer positions, I think that we're trying to challenge your points there. They are only challenges to me that I can't honestly conceptualize as a Christian. I find it difficult to come up with any rational argument for when violence would be necessary as a Christian. I want to commit to this absolute sense, but I recognize, I think, this personal, the deep conflicts of living in a world marred by sin, and our inability to just to function in almost any other way than have some use of force in some ways that I don't know if I can justify. And that's where so I am deeply challenged by this conversation, and I'm really glad that we had this conversation, and I hope that we can continue to talk about it more. But I am interested to hear people's comments,
for sure, and
to go deeper, and maybe if we can expand in the future on anything that we've touched on here that was a little complicated. I'd like to do that and maybe bring some clarity to it. But Colin, great conversation, good episode.
Thanks.
I think,
yeah.
of the Deep Dive.